a man stands in the smoking ruins of everything he ever believed was permanent, and instead of turning away, instead of simply grieving in silence, he does something genuinely audacious. He starts arguing with God, not cursing him, not walking away from him, arguing with him directly, honestly, demanding an answer to the question every single person who has ever watched something they loved get destroyed eventually has to ask, in one form or another, why did you let this happen, and what, if anything, comes next? That man's name is Baruch, and you actually already know him, even if, like me for a long time, you've genuinely forgotten. He's Jeremiah's own scribe, named directly in your own Bible, the man who sat and wrote down Jeremiah's prophecies word for word, while Jerusalem's destruction was still only a warning rather than a completed catastrophe. Your own Bible tells you plainly what Baruch did before the fall. Tonight, we finally open a text that tells you, at real length, what he actually did after it. I want to be honest with you before we start, the same way I try to be honest with you at the very beginning of every one of these episodes. I've taught through Jeremiah more than once, and Baruch always registered to me as a minor, almost administrative figure, the man who held the pen, not the man whose own grief and questions ever got real narrative attention. It never occurred to me to wonder what a man that close to Jeremiah's prophetic ministry, that intimately involved in warning Jerusalem of its coming fall, might have actually felt once that fall finally catastrophically arrived. Whether he felt any grim vindication in having been right all along, or whether being right about a disaster, this total brought him no comfort whatsoever. This tonight is the story of 2nd Baruch, the fuller reckoning somebody, a long time ago, decided this particular grief and this particular scribe both genuinely deserved. I want to start with something important, because this channel takes the distinction between canon and tradition seriously every single time, and this episode requires an extra layer of that same care right from the outset. There is an actual book of Baruch sitting in the deuterocanonical Apocrypha section of Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, a real, shorter, different text, also attributed to this same scribe. Tonight's text is not that book, and I don't want you walking away from tonight's episode confusing the two. Tonight's text is a separate, much longer, much more theologically ambitious work scholars call 2nd Baruch, or the Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch. And I want that distinction absolutely clear before we go any further, because confusing the two would genuinely blur the exact line this whole channel exists to keep sharp, episode after episode. Before we go any further into the text itself, I want to give a fuller picture of who Baruch actually was in your own canonical Bible, because I think it matters for understanding why later Jewish tradition felt this particular figure deserved such an extensive apocalyptic sequel. Jeremiah chapter 36 describes Baruch taking dictation directly from Jeremiah, writing an entire scroll of the prophet's oracles, then reading them aloud publicly in the temple, and later before the king's officials, and finally before King Jehoiakim himself, who responds by cutting the scroll apart with a penknife and burning it piece by piece in a brazier, one of the most dramatic acts of prophetic defiance and royal rejection recorded anywhere in the Old Testament. Baruch and Jeremiah are then instructed to rewrite the entire scroll from memory, with additional judgment oracles added specifically because of the king's contemptuous destruction of the first copy. Jeremiah chapter 43 shows us Baruch again, this time accused by frightened Judean officials of manipulating Jeremiah into advising against fleeing to Egypt, ultimately being taken to Egypt himself, along with Jeremiah and the remaining Judean refugees after Jerusalem's fall to Babylon. That's the last we hear of him directly in your own canonical text. A faithful scribe, present at both the height of Jeremiah's prophetic confrontation with a rebellious king and the bitter, humiliating aftermath of exile into Egypt, and then simply gone from the narrative entirely, his own eventual fate and his own inner emotional life, never directly addressed again anywhere in the remaining canonical text. I want to note one more small but genuinely telling detail from Jeremiah's own account of Baruch, because I think it deepens our sense of who this man actually was before we watch this later tradition imagine his fuller story. Jeremiah 45 records a short, personal oracle addressed directly to Baruch himself, in which Baruch is described as saying, "Woe is me now, for the Lord hath added grief to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighing, and I find no rest." God's response through Jeremiah doesn't simply dismiss that complaint. It acknowledges the coming devastation plainly. "I will bring evil upon all flesh," while promising Baruch specifically that his own life would be preserved as a prey amid the coming catastrophe, whatever else was lost. I think that's a genuinely remarkable detail to have preserved carefully inside your own canonical text, a private, vulnerable moment of a scribe's own personal despair, recorded plainly and answered directly by God himself, centuries before this later tradition would eventually take that same seed of grief and build an entire, much longer book around it. Let's talk about what we can actually verify about this text. Second Baruch, in its complete and full form, survives in only one single place today, a Syriac manuscript housed in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, copied out carefully by hand somewhere around the 6th or 7th century, many long centuries after most scholars believe the text was originally first composed. But thankfully, we're not left entirely dependent on that single late copy alone for real confidence in the text's genuine antiquity. A fragment of the underlying Greek version was discovered among the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a massive cache of ancient documents recovered from an Egyptian rubbish heap that has given scholars real windows into all sorts of otherwise lost ancient texts. That Greek fragment confirms something genuinely important, worth pausing on before we move any further. This text really did circulate in real Greek translation at some point in its transmission history, almost certainly translated itself from an original Hebrew or Aramaic composition before eventually, centuries later, reaching us today only through that single surviving Syriac witness housed carefully in that library in Milan. Most careful, serious scholars date the text's actual composition to somewhere in the decades immediately following the year 70, the same catastrophic year we discussed in our Apocalypse of Abraham episode, when Roman forces destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The text frames its narrative around an earlier destruction, the Babylonian conquest of 586 BC, placing Baruch at the scene of that first fall rather than the second, more recent one. I want you to notice this literary device clearly, because it's a genuinely common technique across this whole body of ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature, setting a text's action inside an earlier analogous historical crisis, using that distant, already canonical precedent to process and theologically interpret a much more recent, still raw catastrophe the actual audience was still actively living through in real time. I think it's worth pausing to ask why this device worked so effectively for these ancient authors, rather than simply naming it and moving on. Writing directly and explicitly about the year 70's catastrophe, in the immediate aftermath of Roman conquest, would have carried real, obvious political danger. A conquered people publicly processing their grief and their hope for eventual restoration under the nose of the very empire that had just crushed their rebellion. Setting the same theological wrestling inside the earlier, safely distant Babylonian destruction, let these authors say everything they actually needed to say about their own contemporary catastrophe, using Jeremiah's own well-established prophetic authority as cover, without directly, dangerously naming Rome as the target of whatever judgment or eventual reversal their visions promised. I think that's worth remembering every time we read apocalyptic literature from this general era. The coded, displaced settings weren't simply a literary convention chosen for its own sake. They were very often a genuine survival strategy, letting real, dangerous political and theological content circulate safely under the cover of ancient, already authoritative historical precedent no occupying power could plausibly object to or censor, since it was already sitting uncontested inside Israel's own long-accepted canonical history. Let's open the story itself now, because the text begins with real, unflinching grief, and I don't want to rush past it. I want to describe the opening setting of the text a little more fully before we reach that vision, because the narrative gives real, specific circumstances worth hearing. Baruch is described standing beside Jeremiah at the walls of Jerusalem, both of them already aware, through earlier prophetic warning, that the city's fall is now imminent and unavoidable. God speaks to Baruch directly. instructing him to leave the city along with Jeremiah before the final destruction, promising directly and explicitly that both men will be spared specifically to witness and to properly process what's about to happen, rather than simply perishing alongside the city and everyone else still inside its walls. I think it's worth noting how this framing immediately establishes Baruch's own survival and his resulting responsibility to make theological sense of what he survives, as central to the whole text's purpose from its very first scene. He isn't simply presented as a passive victim of the catastrophe, but rather as a deliberately chosen witness to it, tasked specifically and directly with carrying its full meaning forward to every single generation that comes after him. Baruch, standing before the walls of Jerusalem, receives a vision confirming what he already fears. The city and its temple are about to fall, this time not simply to human military conquest, but to angels themselves, who descend and remove the sacred vessels from the temple before the earthly destruction even begins, preserving them for a future restoration rather than letting them fall into pagan hands. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it does real theological work before the destruction narrative even properly begins. This text insists, from its very opening scene, that whatever destruction is about to unfold, it isn't a defeat of God by pagan armies, isn't evidence that Israel's God has simply lost a contest of raw power against Rome or Babylon. The sacred vessels are removed by God's own angels, on God's own initiative, before the human destroyers ever arrive. A deliberate signal that everything about to happen remains under divine control, however devastating it will feel to the people actually living through it. I want to walk through the angelic vessel removal scene in a bit more detail before we move to the destruction itself, because the text stages it with real dramatic care. Baruch describes 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the city, each holding a burning torch, poised to set the walls alight, when a 5th angel descends and commands them to wait until the sacred vessels of the temple are safely removed. This 5th angel then enters the Holy of Holies itself and retrieves the veil, the ark, the mercy seat, the 2 tablets, the priestly vestments, the altar of incense, and the rest of the temple's most sacred furnishings, commanding the earth itself to swallow them and preserve them safely until, in the text's own words, the last times when Jerusalem will be restored, and these very same vessels return to their rightful place. I think that detail is worth dwelling on, because it directly answers a real, practical grief question this text's original audience would have been asking urgently: what actually happened to the temple's most sacred objects, physically, when Rome's soldiers finally broke through? This text answer refuses to let those objects fall into pagan hands at all. They were already gone, hidden safely by God's own angels before the destroyers ever arrived to find them. And then, finally, the destruction itself actually comes, and Baruch's grief, once it fully arrives, is genuinely raw and genuinely unguarded from the very first line. He tears his clothes, sits in the dust, and delivers an extended lament mourning not only the physical destruction but the deeper, harder question sitting underneath it. Why would God allow this to happen to the very people and the very place bound up in his own covenant promises? I want to note too how the text describes Baruch's physical posture during this whole extended lament, because the specific details matter for understanding just how total his grief is presented as being. He's described refusing food for extended periods, sitting continuously among the ruins rather than seeking any shelter or comfort elsewhere, and at several distinct points collapsing entirely into what the text describes as a kind of overwhelming trance or overwhelmed, exhausted silence before finally finding the strength within himself to speak again. I think these physical details matter because they refuse to let Baruch's grief remain purely intellectual or theological. It's embodied, disruptive, genuinely incapacitating at points, a real, total, whole-body response to a real, total loss, rather than merely a controlled, composed, careful theological meditation delivered safely from some distant, unaffected emotional remove. I want to give some of Baruch's actual words from this lament, because I think the raw specificity of his questions matters more than any summary can fully convey. He asks God directly why the wicked nations who destroyed Jerusalem seem to prosper, while Zion itself lies in ruins, demanding directly to know, why has Israel been given over to the nations for a reproach, and the people whom thou hast chosen been given to godless tribes? A question he refuses to let pass without a real, satisfying answer. He goes further still, asking bluntly whether it would honestly have been better for the whole world never to have been created at all, rather than have it come to a moment as genuinely devastating and as total as this one. I want you to notice how far this text is willing to let Baruch's questions go. Not polite, careful theological inquiry, but genuine, borderline despairing accusation, asking whether existence itself might have been a mistake given the scale of the loss he's just witnessed. I think this level of raw honesty is worth taking seriously as a real theological achievement in its own right, not simply as an emotional outburst the text needs to move past quickly. It insists quietly but firmly that any faith genuinely capable of surviving real catastrophe has to first be capable of asking genuinely catastrophic questions without flinching or looking away from how dark and how uncomfortable those questions actually are. I want to be honest with you about how directly this text engages that question, because it doesn't offer an easy or immediate answer. Baruch essentially argues with God across several extended dialogues, demanding to understand how covenant faithfulness and covenant catastrophe can possibly coexist, echoing in real ways the same raw theological wrestling you find in your own Book of Lamentations, traditionally also connected to Jeremiah's circle, mourning this same city's earlier fall in language just as reflects real, practical thinking about the actual mechanics of long-distance ancient communication, dressed up in suitably marvelous apocalyptic clothing, the eagle standing in for whatever combination of divine assistance and simple, narrative expedients the author needed to get his letter across an otherwise impossibly vast distance to reach its intended audience. The letter's core message is direct and pastoral rather than elaborately apocalyptic. With the temple destroyed and the land itself no longer securely held, faithfulness to God's law becomes the one thing the scattered exiles can carry with them wherever they go, the one form of covenant loyalty no army or catastrophe can take away from them. For if we direct and dispose our hearts, the letter says in essence, we shall receive everything that we lost, and much better things. I think this closing pastoral turn matters because it shifts the whole text's final emphasis away from cosmic visions of history and resurrection and towards something far more immediately practical: ordinary faithfulness, ordinary daily obedience to the law, as the one thing genuinely available to a devastated, scattered community that has lost everything else that once made their identity feel secure and geographically anchored. I want to note as well how the letter addresses a specific, practical anxiety its scattered recipients would very likely have carried. Whether continuing to observe the law in a foreign land, far from Jerusalem and its now destroyed temple, could really carry the same weight and the same meaning it once had when performed in the land itself, surrounded by the full apparatus of temple worship. The letter answers that anxiety directly, insisting that the law's authority was never actually dependent on the land or the temple in the first place, that it belongs fully to the people themselves wherever they happen to be scattered, and that faithful observance in exile carries exactly the same covenant weight it always did. I think that's a genuinely significant theological claim, effectively decoupling covenant faithfulness from any single geographic location. And I think it helped make continued Jewish religious life not just survivable, but genuinely meaningful in exactly the kind of scattered, landless circumstances so much of the Jewish diaspora would go on to actually experience for centuries following this catastrophe. I want to bring in one more real piece of the letter's content, because I think it's worth hearing in its own specific words, rather than only summarized. The letter tells its scattered readers directly that the days will come when the time of the age will have ripened, and the harvest of the evil and good seeds will come, urging patience and continued faithfulness precisely because the community's current scattered, landless condition is explicitly framed as temporary rather than permanent. I think it's worth noting how this letter refuses the two easiest, most tempting responses to catastrophic loss: despair on one side, insisting nothing matters anymore since everything that once anchored identity is gone, and denial on the other, insisting the loss wasn't really so significant after all. Instead, it takes a harder, more honest middle path. The loss is real and genuinely significant, and yet ordinary faithfulness in exile still matters, still counts, still connects the scattered community back to the same covenant promises that once centered on the temple now in ruins. I want to connect this letter's practical, law-centered emphasis to something we know happened historically in the real aftermath of the temple's destruction, because I think it strengthens the case for reading this text as a genuine, historically grounded response to real crisis rather than pure abstract theology. We know, from other historical sources entirely independent of this text, that Judaism as a whole underwent a genuine, significant transformation in the decades following 70 AD, shifting its center of gravity away from temple-based sacrificial worship, now impossible without a functioning temple, toward synagogue-based study and observance of the law, a transformation associated with figures like Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai and the Rabbinic Academy traditionally said to have been established at Yavne. This letter's emphasis on law observance, as the community's one remaining, portable anchor fits remarkably well with that same broader historical transformation, suggesting this text may be capturing, in real time, exactly the theological reasoning that helped an entire religious tradition survive the loss of its central sanctuary and reorganize itself around something no army could ever destroy or carry away. I want to note one more structural feature of this text before making that comparison, because I think it's worth understanding how deliberately organized the whole book actually is, rather than treating it as a loose collection of visions strung together without real internal architecture. Scholars who've studied the text structure closely have identified a clear repeating pattern across its length: periods of lament and fasting, followed by prayer, followed by a vision or dialogue with God, followed by a public address to the remaining people, repeated several times across the book's full arc before finally arriving at the letter to the exiles that closes it. I think that repeating structure matters because it shows this wasn't composed as a single unbroken outpouring of grief and hope. It was carefully built, movement by deliberate movement, each cycle pushing Baruch's own understanding a little further forward, mirroring, in its own literary architecture, the same kind of patient, repeated working through of grief the text's content itself keeps insisting is necessary. I want to hold this text up for a moment against the Apocalypse of Abraham, which we walked through together earlier in this same batch, because I think the comparison is genuinely illuminating. Both texts emerge from roughly the same historical moment, both wrestling directly with the temple's destruction, and yet each chooses a strikingly different narrative strategy to process that shared catastrophe. The Apocalypse of Abraham reaches backward into the covenant's founding moment, showing Abraham himself a vision of the destruction centuries in advance, framing the catastrophe as something already known and already accounted for within the earliest covenant promises. This text, instead, places its narrator directly at the scene of an earlier, analogous destruction, using historical parallel rather than covenant foreknowledge to process the same underlying grief. I think it's worth noticing that these two texts, likely composed within a few decades of each other by authors who may never have known of each other's work, independently arrived at two genuinely different, equally sophisticated literary strategies for answering the same devastating question. How do you hold on to covenant faith after watching its central physical symbol reduced to rubble? I want to widen the lens now and think about why this text matters, set alongside everything else we've covered on this channel about the Jewish community's response to the temple's fall in the year 70. I think what's genuinely striking about 2nd Baruch is how it refuses to choose between honest grief and genuine hope, holding both together across its entire length rather than rushing past the grief to reach the hope more quickly, or wallowing in the grief without ever actually arriving at hope at all. Baruch argues with God, genuinely at real length, before ever receiving his vision of restoration. The black and bright water's vision doesn't erase the black periods it depicts. It simply insists they aren't the final word. The resurrection material doesn't pretend death and disfigurement don't matter. It insists, instead, that they're temporary, that recognition comes first and glory comes after, in that specific order, honoring exactly what was lost before transforming it into something greater. I want to note one more real scholarly angle before turning to that closing reflection, because I think it's worth flagging honestly. Scholars have long debated the precise relationship between this text and its close relative 4th Ezra, another Jewish apocalypse composed around the same general period and wrestling with essentially the same catastrophe. The two texts share enough structural and thematic similarity, extended dialogue with an angel or with God directly, symbolic historical visions, a developed messianic and resurrection theology, that some scholars have proposed a direct literary relationship, one text influencing or borrowing from the other, while others argue the similarities simply reflect two authors independently working within the same broader genre conventions and responding to the same shared historical crisis. I don't think this specific scholarly debate has been genuinely, fully settled, and I want you to know that honestly, rather than confidently asserting a definitive answer either way tonight. What's clear, regardless of which specific theory turns out correct, is that these two texts together represent the two most theologically developed Jewish responses to the temple's fall that have survived from this whole era, each pushing hard, from its own distinct angle, on exactly the same difficult questions about justice, resurrection, and covenant faithfulness that a catastrophe this total and this sudden inevitably forced onto anyone still trying to hold their whole faith together in its immediate, raw aftermath. I think about that structure in relation to my own experience of grief more than I expected to when I sat down to study this text. Real grief in my own life and in what I've watched in the lives of people close to me rarely moves in a straight line from devastation to comfort. It moves the way this text moves, arguing, demanding, refusing easy answers, before eventually, slowly, arriving at something like hope, a genuine hope that never actually erases what was truly lost, but somehow, patiently, learns to hold it alongside the promise of everything still yet to come. I don't think Baruch's raw, unguarded anger at the start of this text is a failure of his faith. I've come to genuinely believe it's the necessary, honest ground his eventual hope actually had to be carefully built on top of, rather than simply around it or in spite of it. I want to say a little more about what I think this text specifically gets right about the actual shape and timing of real grief, because I think it resists a temptation a lesser version of this same story might have fallen into. It would have been easy for this text to have Baruch's questions answered quickly, his anger resolved neatly within a single exchange, moving on briskly toward the more triumphant visionary material. Instead, the text lets Baruch's dialogue with God stretch across many extended chapters, circling back repeatedly to the same underlying grief and the same underlying questions from slightly different angles each time, never fully closing the subject before genuinely moving forward. I think that structural patience is itself a real theological claim, dramatized through the text's own pacing rather than stated directly. That grief this significant genuinely does need real time and real repetition to work through honestly, and that rushing toward resolution too quickly would have cheapened whatever hope eventually followed it. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close, because I think it's the piece of tonight's material most worth carrying forward. We tend to imagine faithful grief as something that should resolve fairly quickly into acceptance and hope, and I think if we're honest, a lot of us feel a quiet pressure, whether from ourselves or from the people around us, to arrive at that resolution faster than our actual grief is often ready to move. This text refuses that pressure entirely. It lets a real, named, genuinely canonical figure argue directly with God at real, genuine length, circle back to the same unresolved pain again and again, before finally, slowly, arriving at a vision capable of holding real hope alongside real loss rather than simply replacing one with the other. I think that's a genuinely important model, whatever we ultimately decide about this text's own historical claims, permission to grieve as long and as honestly as grief this real actually requires, trusting that hope, when it finally does arrive, will be sturdier and more truthful for having waited. If tonight gave you a reason to finally wonder what happened to Jeremiah's own scribe after the fall, comment the word "watched" below. I read every single one, and I mean that sincerely, and I try to answer as many as I honestly can. Send this to someone who's ever had to argue honestly and openly with God in the middle of real, devastating loss. Someone who's still, maybe even right now tonight, standing quietly in their own version of Baruch's ruins, waiting for an answer that genuinely hasn't fully arrived yet. And if you want more of these forgotten and buried scriptures, the ones that finally give real voice to grief your Bible only had room to gesture toward, subscribe to the Buried Scripture. Keep your own Bible close this week and every single week after this one, and keep reading it patiently enough to notice the grief it sometimes carries just as honestly as the hope. Keep noticing the minor named figures it introduces and then leaves behind, and keep wondering what fuller grief and what fuller hope might be waiting quietly behind their one or two recorded appearances. I want to add one closing thought about Baruch specifically, because I think his story, minor as it seems on the surface of your canonical text, actually models something worth carrying with you well past tonight's episode. He was never the prophet. He was the scribe, the one who held the pen, who wrote down someone else's words, who stood in the shadow of Jeremiah's much larger, much more dramatic ministry. And yet this later tradition looked at that quiet supporting role and decided it deserved its own reckoning with catastrophe, its own honest wrestling with loss, its own vision of eventual restoration. I think there's something worth taking from that choice, whatever we ultimately believe about the text's historical accuracy. The people who hold the pen, who do the quiet, supporting work behind someone else's more visible calling, carry real grief and real hope of their own, fully as significant as the grief and hope of whoever stands more visibly at the center of the story. This text gives Baruch that recognition. I think the rest of us could stand to extend the same recognition more often to the quieter people, doing exactly that kind of supporting work in our own lives. I want to close with one more reflection on the broader family of texts this whole recent stretch of episodes has belonged to. Between the Apocalypse of Abraham and this text tonight, we've now spent real time inside two separate ancient Jewish attempts to make theological sense of the single most devastating event of that entire era, watching everything a community had built its whole religious life around get physically destroyed within living memory. I think it's worth naming, honestly, how much courage it actually took to write texts like these at all in the immediate aftermath of exactly that kind of loss. It would have been far easier to fall silent, to let grief simply sit unprocessed and unexamined, or to retreat into simple comforting denial about how bad the loss actually was. These authors did neither. They sat down in the rawest possible aftermath of real catastrophe and tried to say something true and something hopeful at the very same time, refusing to let either one cancel out the other. I think that's a genuinely admirable thing to have attempted, whatever we ultimately decide about how successfully either text actually pulled it off. And I think it's exactly the kind of honest, hard-won courage worth remembering the next time any of us finds ourselves standing, in whatever form our own life happens to take it, among the ruins of something we once believed was permanent, and keep believing that honest, unguarded grief and genuine hope were never actually opposites, that the truest hope is very often the kind built directly on top of grief that was allowed to be fully, honestly felt first. Thank you for spending this hour with a scribe who put down Jeremiah's words for years, and finally, after everything he'd watched fall, was given the space and the time to say a few honest words of his own. Go well tonight, and carry with you whatever honest questions you're still working through in your own life right now. Scripture quotations are from the King James Version. Details from 2nd Baruch are drawn from the surviving Syriac manuscript tradition, alongside the Greek fragment discovered among the Oxyrhynchus papyri in standard scholarly English translation, not the King James Version, since this book was never part of that translation and should not be confused with the shorter, separate deuterocanonical Book of Baruch found in some Bible's Apocrypha section. A distinction I want to restate plainly one final time, given how easily the two texts' shared attributed author could otherwise blur together in memory after tonight. If you read any of this differently than I do, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Drop your thought in the comments below, and thank you sincerely for spending this hour with a man who once held someone else's pen, and finally, after everything he'd lost, was given the space to write his own honest words instead.